Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the majority of Britons lived in the country, farming to support themselves and their families. Villagers utilized an open field system with each other, which allowed each family to have their own plot of land within communally managed common land. These common lands provided pasture for livestock, had fields of wheat and other cereals that were grown with everyone's cooperation, as well as opportunities to forage for wild foods, fish, animals, and fuel. Villagers satisfied most of their basic needs with what the land provided. Even the poorest members could support themselves by foraging, and then had the potential to build up wealth by grazing animals on common pasture and increasing their numbers. However, eventually rights to common lands eroded away. The process sped up with Parliament's passage of the General Enclosure Act in 1801 at the urging of the aristocracy. It provided the legal framework to end traditional rights of villagers and to expel them from their homes. Wealthy landowners were able to claim ownership of communal lands, and in their words, improve them, by first dividing up the land and enclosing it with fences, walls, or hedges through which commoners and their livestock could not pass. Those villagers who had owned their plots of land were compensated with usually inferior property, and those that had rented were simply kicked out. Many remained reluctant to leave, so aristocracy hired men to burn down dwellings. In response, groups of angry farmers gathered together to resist the loss of their rights and livelihoods. They attempted to fight back, but were quickly squashed, sometimes massacred, by hired mercenaries. Agricultural land prices then climbed by about 77% between 1798 and 1801, making it difficult for small landowners to exist. All this led to the beginning of the Agricultural Revolution, or commercial farming. The newly enlarged landowners hired only a fraction of the displaced farmers, the rest of whom were forced to consider a life of vagrancy, or to turn to the rapidly growing cities hungry for cheap labor. In the 19th century alone, the rural population dropped by 40%, and the city population swelled at unprecedented speeds, providing the most important ingredient for the Industrial Revolution. Even for the homeless, jobless paupers, the cities hardly provided a welcoming environment. Sanitation services did not exist, so every kind of waste accumulated on the streets before running down towards waterways, polluting the drinking water. Typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis, and cholera sprang up and ravaged populations, killing many. Oftentimes entire families crowded into single rooms, unable to afford rent for larger spaces. But perhaps one of the most disheartening realities was the constant smog filling up the sky and blocking out the sun with toxic clouds. Tremendous amounts of coal were burned to fuel powerful machines producing fantastic outputs in the textile industry never before imagined. And yet, at the same time, an arduous environment developed for the common man, where limits of human endurance were tested daily. For capitalistic laissez-faire government had taken over, inspiring businessmen to extract as much productivity as possible for ever-increasing profits in creative, if not inhumane ways. And the hungry paupers were quickly shaped into the perfect workforce for the textile industry. Factories best supported the new organization of labor needed for high production. Influential men, such as Adam Smith, suggested the need for the division of labor to increase productivity. Smith illustrated an example with pin assembly. 10 average workers creating pins on their own could never produce 20 per person. However, if every worker was given his or her own specialized task, and was inspired to work quickly, then average productivity could potentially reach 4,800 pins per person per day. This theory was put into practice in the factories where essentially every worker became responsible for one task only, which they repeated throughout the day, over and over and over again. Each worker became a master in his or her task, and required no breaks for transitions. Consequently, workers became remarkably efficient, and at the same time easily replaceable, since they only mastered one skill each. In 1832, a parliamentary committee interviewed a young man about his time as a factory worker. He had started at the age of 8, regularly working 14 hours a day, sometimes 16 when business increased. Shift started at 6 or 5 a.m. 1 hour was allotted for lunch, and 1 hour for dinner. Waking up in the mornings was so difficult that his parents had to lift him out of bed to rouse him. On the days he came late, the boy was beaten severely. By the time he came home, he could do nothing but sleep, and oftentimes vomited food he had eaten. As a pisoner, his duty was to take the cardings from one section of the machinery and place them on another, running on his feet for the whole shift. During the latter part of the day, the workers, which were mostly children in that factory, would become deeply fatigued, causing them to lose pace. The overseer then came to beat them. The boy had been beaten primarily with a strap, but at times also with a roller, which was a long stick. Some children had their heads broken after such beatings. Morale was low, and they adopted obscene language to help stimulate themselves. Factory owners oftentimes preferred children as laborious, due to their obedience, and small bodies being able to navigate around machinery more nimbly than adults could. But most importantly, they earned only about 20% of a man's pay, and about 50% of a woman's pay. It was not unusual for owners to fire men and replace them with children in order to cut down on labor costs. Some desperate parents, perhaps sacked or debilitated themselves, were forced to opt their children out of school, which cost money, in order to send them to factories to help cover the minimum costs of living. However, many families refused to allow their children to work in the textile industry, so factory owners turned to orphanages and poorhouses. From there they essentially bought children. These children signed contracts designating themselves property of factory owners, or in other words, became their apprentices, until the age of 22. They were unpaid, being provided merely sufficient food, shelter, and clothing. Rural mills in particular, relied almost entirely on children. Unsurprisingly, people's health seriously deteriorated after prolonged work inside factories. Buildings had no ventilation in order to create optimal conditions for fibers, which required high humidity and warmth to stay supple. Indoor temperatures often reached over 80 degrees from the heat of the machinery and body heat of all of the workers packed into rooms. Clouds of fine particles of fiber floated in the thick air, causing many to develop tuberculosis, bronchitis, and asthma. Without being able to experience sunshine for the majority of their lives, very young children developed a new kind of disease, rickets. The lack of vitamin D caused bones to weaken and the softened legs to bow out of shape, while other bone structures also became deformed. Accidents commonly occurred with the rapidly moving machinery. Small children were most susceptible, but anyone could get caught in a moving part and have an arm or leg broken, or less critically, have a finger snagged and the muscle and skin stripped down to the bone. Some children were entirely crushed. The surgeon Dr. Ward described in 1819 that he had visited a school where a large portion of the children worked in factories, and half of those had sustained injuries. A report from the British House of Commons in 1832 commented that workers were abandoned the moment that an accident occurred. Wages stopped, no medical care was offered, and no compensation afforded for the injury. Besides the textile industry, other industries began booming at the time, including coal mining. Many thousands were hired to work in mines, some as young as 4, since, once again, young children were superior for their small, agile bodies capable of wriggling through tight tunnels and carrying coal to the surface. Many workers developed lung cancer from the dust and died by the age of 25. Workers who tried to form unions were blacklisted, and consequently unable to find work as miners again. Some were obliged to sign bonds that disallowed them from working elsewhere. Upon entering the Industrial Revolution, the ordinary person was defeated in every way. Once a pauper, he or she was destined to slave away their youth, tormented by all types of afflictions along the way, to then be discarded as a broken part of the grand machine. But their loss was not in vain. England had become the most prosperous economic region in the world. Luxury imports and fine living increased tremendously. Of course, a vast wealth disparity existed. In fact, it was much greater than when most Britons were farmers. But a new kind of power had emerged from Britain, capable of influencing the whole country and even the world through wealth and modern, technological sophistication. The ordinary people had been a part of that manifestation. Yet, they may not have felt intense pride or joy. In fact, they may have felt estranged from those other than in their class. The truth is that the height of new military recruits declined by an average of several centimeters from 1760 to 1850 due to malnutrition. But the brightness of new, modern power and money, proudly displayed by the architects of a completely transformed society, drowned out the darkness of a miserable past that had savagely consumed countless lives.